Hello, this is Zach Sokoloff again, reporting on my 8th grade algebra class at Stevenson Middle School. The unit I will address today is Solving Systems of Linear Equations, which I will be teaching after I complete my current unit on graphing linear equations. We are familiarizing ourselves with linear equations, terms like slope and x and y intercepts, and their corresponding graphs. I felt this was an appropriate way to structure my algebra narrative for the year, making our transition into systems as seamless as possible. My unit on systems covers California 8th grade Algebra Standards 8.0, 9.0, and 15.0. I also consulted the Common Core standards when creating my block plan, as these are evidence-based guidelines to drive my planning. This unit spans 14 days, and I will cover new material for the first 10 days. Specific learning targets will be broken down in just a bit. On the 11th day, in preparation for their summative assessment on day 13, students will do station work for the entire period. This will give them a chance to get extra practice on the learning targets they are struggling with the most. Students will be allowed to communicate with their peers during this activity. Marzano emphasizes the importance of verbal explanation and dialogue to truly reinforce newly learned content, and I want to make sure my students feel comfortable with the strategies introduced in this unit before they test. On the 12th day, the students will again be practicing for their test, but this will be silent, independent work. By this point, my students know which learning targets they need to solidify and which they know well, and this final day of preparation will serve them well for their test. I'll be circulating about the classroom, answering any remaining questions my students may have, but I want them to become familiar with solving these problems in an environment as similar to the test as possible. On the 13th day, my students will test. On the 14th day, they'll be handed back their graded exams so they can perform error analysis. My learning targets are as follows. Each learning target represents 1 day's material, except for the learning targets on the substitution and elimination methods. Those are very complicated topics, and I will spend 2 days covering these strategies. For A, I can determine if lines are perpendicular, parallel, or neither by analyzing their slope. For B, I can explain what a system of equations is and how many solutions one can have. For C, I can solve a system of equations using the graphing method. For D, I can verify algebraically if an ordered pair is a solution for a system of equations. For E, I can solve a system of equations using the substitution method. For F, I can solve a system of equations using the elimination method. For G, I can solve a system of equations using a method of choice with justification. And for H, I can solve a system of equations with word problems. Each of my lessons follows the masked format. They begin with a hook and an investigation before explanation. These serve a few purposes. The first is that I ask my students something about themselves, personalizing the lesson and therefore making it more interesting. The second is that it piques my students' curiosity. The IBE is meant to get them thinking about math before it has been explained, so they can try to solve the problem using their prior knowledge or logical reasoning skills. The final reason to begin the lesson in this way is that it primes my students for more rigorous math. This introduction develops what Reddish calls associational activation. The next part of a math lesson is deductive structured notes, which leads into active practice. My students take clear deductive structured notes every class. They also engage in an active practice, which gives them time to refine their skills on their own or in a group of their peers. This again fulfills Marzano's goals of infusing communication into math to reinforce your knowledge. Many of these active practice exercises are also centered around games like tic-tac-toe or Connect 4, adding an element of fun competition into the class, which my students respond to very positively. The lesson wraps up with an exit ticket, which either asks my students to reflect on the material we covered in class, focusing on the areas that might still be giving them problems, or it asks them to solve a problem utilizing their new skills. If an exit ticket falls into the latter category, it will be returned the next day with descriptive feedback. I want to conclude this video by sharing with you 1 day's lesson plan. I chose the first learning target in the unit. For A, I can determine if lines are perpendicular, parallel, or neither by analyzing their slope, and I've created my own set of deductive structured notes to guide me through this lesson. Here's the first page. This is the second page. I'll be walking you through step by step each piece. For my hook, I will show my students a clip from the movie Tron. Hook. There's a scene where the players in the game are riding their futuristic bikes and a colorful trail follows behind them. Two players ride side by side, and it's an engaging and appropriate graphic for representing parallel lines. I will then ask my students to justify, think, pair, share about whether or not these bikes will ever collide if they remain on the same path they're on at present. This forces them to think about the concept graphically, which will dovetail nicely with the remainder of the unit. We will then move to our deductive structured notes, where I give the definitions of parallel and perpendicular lines, as seen here. And this is done in terms of their slope, and I'll provide my students with 2 examples of each. I will then hand out whiteboards, whiteboard markers, and whiteboard erasers so my students can do their guided practice. I will flash a problem onto the PowerPoint slide and give my students a specific amount of time to complete it. When they are done, they will raise their whiteboards in the air, and after I've told them if they're right or wrong, they'll move on to the next problem. Down here you can see some of my deductive structured notes and the whiteboard problems that I'll be giving them. After whiteboards, my students will do their active practice. This lesson's active practice will be a matching game where students need to solve an equation either in y equals mx plus b form or in standard form. They need to solve for the slope, find the matching parallel slope on the other side of the page, and they will also need to calculate what the perpendicular slope would be as well for this particular equation. This incorporates all skills from the unit and lets my students work at their own pace. Here is a written out example of what that active practice might look like. Finally, I will pass out an exit ticket so I can determine what material needs to be retaught or who is still struggling with the concept. This will consist of 2 problems, one asking about perpendicular lines, one asking about parallel lines, and we'll test both topics that we studied that day in class. Here you can see the 2 examples that I will be giving to my students. I've also included here a completed mind map for this unit. My students and I will work on this throughout the unit, adding to it as we cover more material. My students will be reinforcing this in all types of activities, and it will be a great study tool for my students as they begin to prepare for their test. As of now, I need to work on my hooks and IBEs the most. They are mediocre, but with a little more thought, I think that they can become one of the standout components to this unit. Jennifer, if you could please offer feedback specifically with regard to these hooks and maybe provide any ideas that you have, I'd really appreciate it. I will be adding these artifacts as soon as I can get to a scanner. I'll include this in my email, but unfortunately right now the scanner in my house is not working properly, and so I will upload the video and my block plan, and you should expect the deductive structured notes and the mind map by sometime tomorrow. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to all your feedback.